Here in San Francisco and across the state, teachers like you are working together to foster inclusive classrooms, spark learning, and equip all of our students to succeed. We're now going to move into our next part of the agenda, where we're going to hear from our first EdTalk speaker. EdTalks are one of the elements that make California Teacher Summit so unique. They're a great opportunity to hear directly from our fellow educators in the Bay Area about what's working in their classrooms, the challenges that they have faced, and the innovative ways that they're helping our students learn. These are real-world stories that offer valuable insights for our work and that will hopefully start a dialogue that will continue today and throughout the year. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our first EdTalk speaker and author, David Cohen. David is a National Board Certified English teacher with 20 years of teaching experience, currently on the staff of Palo Alto High School teaching 10th and 11th grade English classes. He helped launch and co-direct a teacher leadership network called Accomplished California Teachers, or ACT. That experience led to him spending the 2014-15 school year traveling around the state to gather material for his book called Capturing the Spark: Inspired Teaching, Thriving Schools. His Ed Week teacher blog is also called Capturing the Spark, and he has also been a blog editor and contributing author at The Standard, a group blog by the National Board Professional Teaching Standards. I invite you to please help me in welcome David Cohen.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here among so many teachers who decided to spend a day learning and talking about what we do together for our students in classrooms and in schools. But for the next 12 minutes or so, I'd like to pull back from that level a little bit and take a broader view of how and why we interact with our communities and with our policymakers. The goal of providing an excellent education to every student in California, an equitable, high-quality public education, is one that we know we need to work on. And so I'd like to pose a couple of questions to you this morning about how we can meet that responsibility that we share as teachers and as citizens. And those questions are, what stories will you tell to help bring about change? And how can you ensure that those stories will be heard in a way that serves our students, our communities, and our profession? In politics and in public relations, they say that if you're not out there making the argument, you're losing the argument. Or if I can borrow a line from the musical Hamilton, I might ask, who tells your story? And that is not just a rhetorical question. There are some powerful and wealthy interests out there who are investing in the narrative of failing public schools and ineffective teachers. Now, their narrative will not hold up against the truth of our stories if we are dedicated enough and vigilant enough to get our stories out there. And so I'd like to ask you to be part of that effort. Okay? Now, there are some negative stories that have already taken hold. Have you heard the one about that awful teacher? Tell me if this sounds familiar. You meet someone for the first time, someone who's not in education, and they find out you're a teacher, and they say, oh, that's wonderful, we need more good teachers. My kids have had pretty good teachers, but there was this one. All right? And for the next 5 or 10 minutes, that's all they want to talk about, the one awful teacher. I will not listen to that story anymore. It does not do us any good to listen to that story again. But I bring it up because it's important to understand that there's a power in negative experiences. Psychological studies have shown that negative is stronger than positive. It takes several positive experiences to counteract a negative. And that's why we need everyone on board to help spread and share the positive stories. We really are better together. My own interest in telling positive stories, a lot of it goes back about 10 years when I was a national board candidate support provider, helping people through the national board certification process. And it was great. I was meeting teachers from all over the Bay Area, watching videos of their teaching and seeing their student work. And the goal was to help them through the certification process. But unfortunately, it sometimes was the case that we had to help them to be evasive and avoid detection when they wanted to do interesting and creative lessons that didn't fit with their grade level pacing guides and their school's canned curriculum. One piece of advice that worked pretty well was to, especially for elementary teachers, make sure that you're in good with the principal's secretary so you know when the principal's off campus. That way you can do this subversive thing like using art or music or even teaching a science or a social studies lesson that's not in the plans, right? And what we were seeing there were the negative consequences of No Child Left Behind. And for those of us observing it, we felt the need to do something about it. So as you heard in that introduction, I helped to start a group called Accomplished California Teachers. And for a while, we found our audience. We used stories and research together to try to improve education policy in California, keeping equity always in mind. And we had some events and presented at some conferences, and we even saw our work cited in the legislative analysis for some bills in the California legislature. And through that process, I was also now meeting teachers from around the state. And so I had an even greater repository of positive stories, and so I asked myself the same questions I asked you. What will I do with those stories, and how will I ensure that they're heard? And so to make a much longer story short, I decided to write a book. I took a whole year off from my own teaching and visited over 70 schools and spoke with over 100 teachers about what we do. And after another year and a half of writing and revising and editing, the book finally came out. As you heard, it's called Capturing the Spark: Inspired Teaching, Thriving Schools. And the book is descriptive in nature. I didn't set out to write dispassionate analysis of effective teaching practice. I wanted to put people in the classrooms to see what it looks like, not only when a teacher is effective, but when a teacher is curious, and when a teacher is inspired, and when a teacher persists, and when a teacher is dedicated and optimistic about the long term of public education. My hope is that people will internalize some of those stories, share some of those stories, and find the motivation to share their own stories as well. Let me tell you a little bit about one of the teachers featured in the book. Her name's Martha Infante. She teaches social studies and history at a middle school in South Central Los Angeles. And as an LA Unified teacher, she knows firsthand what it means to cope with the dysfunction of state and district management or mismanagement, to deal with underfunding chronically, and to deal with, frankly, open disrespect. But she also knows that advocating for her students and her school, it requires some positivity. People need to see her students through her eyes, to understand their intelligence and their wit and their charm and their sweetness and their hopes and their ambitions. So she started a blog called Don't Forget South Central. I came across her blog on Twitter, and within a matter of months had her contributing to the group blog at Accomplished California Teachers. From there, Martha was invited to tell her story at a congressionally authorized Commission on Educator Excellence and Equity. And then she went on to work on a state educator excellence task force, and then even work on to be responsible for revising the report that commission produced called Greatness by Design. Now, Martha didn't wake up one morning, write a blog post, and change public education. What she did was she had a habit of consistent storytelling with a consistent theme and focus on equity, and she turned each opportunity into another opportunity. We can't all be Martha, but what we can do is do a fraction of what she did, and by working together, multiply the impact of our stories. There were a couple important lessons or interesting lessons from the book that I wanted to share, reactions. And one was that people were so grateful when I would come to a school to observe and write. And that had nothing to do with me. I think that spoke to a yearning that so many people have to see public education presented in a positive and understanding light. Another interesting reaction came from a friend of mine who is familiar with many schools in Oakland, and she asked if I had visited any. I told her I had spent a full day at Brookfield Elementary School, and all right, and she said, "Why Brookfield?" in a tone that conveyed a negative preconception about the school. And I told her, in a way, I went to Brookfield precisely because of your reaction, because with struggling schools, so often the failures are assumed and the strengths are almost invisible. And my friend Tammy Adams has poured decades of effort and great teaching and school leadership into Brookfield Elementary, and those stories need to be heard as well. And we all need to play a part in that, in telling those stories to help bring about a more equitable system. Now, equity is not going to be cheap. We have to invest more. California, even after Proposition 30, Proposition 55, and the local control funding formula, our investment in public education lags behind most states. And in some of our most distressed communities, we have districts that are trying to tackle greater challenges with half the per pupil spending of some of their wealthier neighboring districts. And we know that that's not right. It would be nice if we could just gather the data and the research and present that and appeal to logic and fairness and win the day. But stories matter. We have to bring those stories. And unfortunately, as I mentioned before, negative stories have a stronger impact. And when it's a negative story about inequity, I've also observed that the impact it has is disengagement. When we hear about the negatives and inequities, we don't want to engage. It's a challenging and seemingly insurmountable problem sometimes. So we have an even greater challenge. We have to bring more positive stories to present the problem of inequity as an opportunity for California to step up and do the right thing for all of its students, to take these positives and spread them. And so I ask you once again, what stories will you tell to be part of that, and how can you get them out there? Your stories do not have to be dramatic. I think they need to be vivid and unique. And I'll just give you a few examples and ask, what could we learn if we knew more of these stories? If we could go 4 miles from here, we could see San Francisco Community School, which is a K-8 alternative school, public school in San Francisco Unified, that's led by its teachers, not by its administrators. Or what could we learn by going to San Jose to observe it's a nice science lesson. Second graders pouring tons of salt into tubs of water, waiting to see if an egg will float to the top. And it's a nice science lesson done by a very caring, dedicated teacher named Alicia DeRollo, who also happens to be a former union president and a current member of the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing. So what if we understood how all of that came together? What if we understood Merced High School? And how is it that they were able to collect thousands of dollars in grant money from the California Teachers Association Institute for Teaching so that their students could do authentic historical research and produce professional quality museum exhibits? These examples are out there, and we need to find more of them. And then back to you. What can you do to tell your stories and to share them? Real briefly, you can go old school. You can write letters to the editor, and you can call your policymakers on the phone, and you can go to speak to community organizations and speak to policymakers at office hours and town halls and visit them in person. You can go digital and share these positive stories as much as possible, over and over. We need to be relentless on this. Through social media, share the good things that are happening. You could start a blog. Or if you want a little less commitment, you could contribute a guest post to an existing blog. You could start a podcast or a YouTube channel. And if you need to learn how to do any of these things, do that. We learn, right? I would also encourage more people to get involved in sharing their stories with their unions, if you're a member of a union. They need to hear the good too, not just the relentless complaints and negativity. They need the positives as well. Be part of the union and make